Started, and while people are jumping on, I do want to say that this webinar is being recorded, and I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. At the Millicent Rogers Museum, we are located on ancestral lands of the Tiwa-speaking people, known today as the Red Willow people of Taos Pueblo. We strive to deepen our relationship with the Red Willow people through collaboration, while acknowledging and honoring the complex history of the Red Willow people, past, present, and future generations. We express gratitude to this land and to the Taos Pueblo elders and ancestors who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. And Tlacaelel, would you like to add something to that?
Sure. I would like to add that we are all guests on this land that has in fact been occupied since time immemorial by the original inhabitants, all the way up into Canada and all the way down into the Aztecas. So we've been around a long time, and those of us who are original have maintained the land, and also those of us who are guests are now on indigenous land. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. So welcome to our audience to Millicent Unplugged. Papel Picado, Layers of Cultural Expression is our topic this evening. I'm Karen Chertok, the Director of Education at MRM, joined by Sarah Francis, photographer, author, speaker, museum friend, and volunteer moderator, and MRM curator, Claire Motzinger. Together, we welcome our guests, Anita Rodriguez and Tlacaelel Trujillo Fuentes. Papel Picado is colorful, translucent tissue paper cut into intricate patterns and originating in Mexico and beyond. As we honor National Hispanic Heritage Month, we root this conversation in an art form associated with a universal element of paper. What can Papel Picado teach? And what are some of the cultural influences, both forward and back in time? Originally, stacks of colored paper would be finely cut or chiseled with a knife, resulting in a uniformity of design on tissue paper, gently peeled and strung into banners that flutter. Taking paper art to a deeper level, Tlacaelel Trujillo y Fuentes embraces the ancient to ponder the contemporary, including layers of cultural identity that inspire unique self-expression. Anita Rodriguez, artist, social activist, and culture bearer, has employed various techniques and art media to examine, explore, question, and amplify the beauty and complexity of cultural identity. Thank you for joining us. Please use the chat feature, and we will highlight audience comments throughout the program. We will also allow time at the end for Q&A if you would like to use that feature as well. Sarah, do you want to get us started?
I do. And before we even start, there is a special shout out to Miss Anita because of her recently published book. There it is, which is up for several awards. And we thank you for that. I had fun reading it, and it will go into my personal library. So thank you, Anita.
I'm flattered. Thank you.
Congratulations. How recently is it that you published that?
I think it's a couple of years.
Is it that old?
Yeah.
Then it's just on the awards circuit at this point.
Right. Yeah, it takes a little while.
Well, as we start talking about Papel Picado today, we keep finding just the immense number of different places around the world where paper arts started. And we want to honor each one of these. And as I personally started looking at, okay, where are we going to go with this idea and this art and the things it means to different people, I kept finding new things. And I kept finding, of all things, my jewelry, which has a bit of an Aztec feel to it, a little women's milagro. And of course, it's made out of silver, but it could easily have been a Papel Picado in the past. And so we want to go immediately, Tlacaelel, to our expert, and start by telling us where you came into the paper in that it got into your hands along with the scissors.
Well, I don't know if I'm an expert, but it all started for me 66 years ago, about 60 years ago, when I was in elementary school. And I remember in kindergarten, the teacher gave us the little scissors, which we all remember, with the rounded edges, and this beautiful paper and the feel of it and the colors. And I started cutting, and it just felt so wonderful. And I remember thinking, I'm not done with this. And I'm not done with it here at class today. So I actually took a pair of scissors home without asking, and I hid them from my parents, because if they had seen those scissors, they would have asked me where they came from, and I would have had to say, oh, I don't know. So I've been cutting paper since then, and the feel of paper, the smell of paper, there's papers that, have like papers that are made with fruits or vegetables, or that have papers, fruits or vegetables embedded in them. They have a smell to them. And so all of those things, the texture, the history, the feel, and it's always stayed with me. And I still love seeing it and feeling it today, and cutting it and creating. As a kinetic human being, I'm always restless to see what my next piece is going to be. Thank you for asking.
I don't dare go to the art store ever and look at the papers, because I come home with a giant box of them, and then you just want to feel it. There's something about feeling the goods of paper. And I probably, talking just from the tactile sense, Claire, as the administrator, or the what do we call you, the collections chief, the jefe of collections,
collections manager.
How do you feel that that's something that you want to do too?
The tactile quality of material culture is what drew me to museum work in the first place. I started in studio arts, and the comment of "you don't dare go into an art store" I relate to very strongly. But I love that tactile quality, and it makes me think of, particularly when you were speaking, Tlacaelel, is the amate paper of Mesoamerica, of the Aztecs, where Papel Picado often, is considered to come from. Amate paper has a very special quality, tactile wise, because it does have more texture than maybe we associate with conventionally, modern paper making, commercial paper making. It has all of this texture and all of this quality because of the fiber that it's made from. And it is so rich, and it does have a smell, and it does have a very special surface to it. Have you worked with amate paper ever before?
Are you asking, have I?
Yes.
Yeah, I've experimented with that idea of the duality, and just like the necklace that we were just shown, it's very symmetrical, right? What's on this side is on this side, and so experimenting with that duality, the two sides of something. So I have worked with papel amado. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. The Spanish came along and changed it to amate.
Here's another one, or two images, I should say, Tlacaelel's contemporary work. Tell us about these two.
The green is a piece I showed recently at Art Santa Fe. It was an international exhibit, and I call this one torso because you can see it. You can see it's a very muscular torso. You can see people like this, whether they're female or male, and they're very muscular and well built. But there's also another aspect to it, and there's the playful figures inside that look like, in some ways, reflective of Matisse's dancing figures, and they're sort of in a lovely little dance with each other. But I saw it more as a torso. The piece on the blue piece, I sold that, and I'm very happy to say it went to a private collector in New York City. And if you can see, there's the reference to the pyramids, because I always try to maintain a connection to my culture, and that sense of how do I maintain what I've learned from Papel Picado in my current work as a contemporary Chicano artist. And this is a way that I can continue to do my new contemporary work with the connection to my Azteca roots as a Mexicano artist. And so those two pieces are, I had a great time doing them. And I'm really thrilled that the blue piece was engaging enough to the person who decided they would like to have that in their own collection. And so, yeah, those are very current pieces. Those were done within the last 6 or 7 months.
And so we absolutely want to know, do you cut paper in bed like Matisse?
You know, I never even heard of Matisse until one day I was, I had a show up in New York City, and somebody came and said, "Oh, this reminds me of Henry Matisse." And I didn't know who he was. So I started doing research and finding out who he was. And so I said, "Oh, I can see why." I see that MJ is asking, how do we verify that the paper I use is archival? Well, that is a very good question. In the green paper and the blue paper there on the pieces behind Sarah, those are archival because they were handmade, and I experimented with them, hanging them in the window, and noticed that it took them a very, very long time to fade. We just also, the white is watercolor paper. So it will change with time. And that's going to be interesting to see how they evolve through the years. You know, oil paintings crack, paper fades, but it'll be interesting to see. There's one piece that you were showing, it's called Ventana Rosa, or Rose Window. And I did that in 2000. So 24 years later, there it is, the yellow cross.
Mm-hmm.
I did that in 2004. So 20 years later, it's held up very well. And it had been hanging in the Michael Gorman Gallery for like 6 years now. And it's still very vibrant. I was concerned about, how will it hold up, but it's held up very well. The piece that shows the other cross with the nuclear image. When I first moved to New Mexico in 1987, I was taken with the idea that the atomic bomb was originated here at White Sands Missile Range with Oppenheimer and Fermi and all those guys. And so I wanted to do a reflection of how do we maintain that spiritual sense of human love and compassion with that sense of let's make bombs to, destroy other cultures. And so I wanted to do a reflection of how do we balance that? And I hope that piece reflects how do we deal with reality, both the good and the bad, the beauty and the ugly. And that piece, I thought, captures that sense of the explosion, but then also the sense of the spirituality of our humanness.
I think that's a really nice segue into talking about layers of expression and layers of interpretation in a piece and layers of meaning. And I know that, Anita, your paintings are really representative of the layers in Taos and in the community. And if you want to speak to that aspect of the arts.
Show some of the pieces so that I could.
I'm going to. Give me a second here. Let's go here.
Okay. Let's go to the bee painting.
The B one.
Yes. Okay. Well,
I
that
can't make it bigger. It's a background.
You can.
I can't make it bigger on
Okay,
there.
well, that's good enough. It's changed back again.
I can put this
Yeah,
one.
hold the bee painting so that I can talk about the bee painting.
Okay.
Okay. It's gone again.
I think when you talk, Anita, the camera goes to you.
Ah,
Oh, it may depend on your settings. If you're in view, if you go in the upper right-hand corner
yeah.
in view and have it be gallery view, you can see all of us.
Okay, that's better.
Is
Okay.
that better?
Yes, now we've got a stable image, right? Okay. Well, there are lots of layers in there, layers of meanings. And in a way, it reminds me of Papel Picado because it's so fine. And in the background, you can't quite see at this dimension, but in the background, it's like a honeycomb, a tiny detailed honeycomb drawn in gold paint. But there are lots of layers of meaning in that. And one of them is La Santísima Muerte. I lived in Mexico for 15 years in Guanajuato at the beginning of the narco wars. And the image of La Santísima Muerte sprang up everywhere. Suddenly there were shrines to her all along the highway and everywhere, because one of her specialties is she gives you a good death, which nobody was getting during that time. I mean, some really macabre and grisly things were happening in Mexico because of the narco wars. And she also is an advocate for the disenfranchised, the poor, the marginalized, those who don't believe in the government and the church anymore. So that's at least half of Mexico, right? So, you know, that's one of the layers. You know, I call it La Santísima de Amber y las Avispas. And she's symbolizes a bee, which to remind us once again that we only have one planet. And La Santísima Muerte is saying, you know, you've only got one planet. Have you ever thought about the death of your planet? And so that's another layer of meaning there. And then above her are flowers, and above of those are datura and poppies down below, which once again not only evoke the narco wars because they are both origins of narcotics, but they also evoke like mysticism, see along the top of the thing. So there are all these different layers of meaning in all of the paintings. The paintings are intensely allegorical. And unlike you, Tlacaelel, I don't start out spontaneously. I have an idea, and then I start out with the idea, but I never know what's going to happen. I start out with just an idea, and then I feel like almost like I'm channeling. It's like I'm just trying to stay on the horse.
Wow.
So, you know, like the piece develops a life of its own and carries me with it, and I become its like, you know, servant. So, and this is a very, very powerful image. I mean, she sprang up all over Mexico, and she's ancient. She's pre-Columbian. Her real name is Mitrantecuhtli Tantecuhtli, and she's the goddess of the underworld. And she's deep in the Mexican psyche. And when her people needed her, she came. And then the Federales began to realize that all the narcotraficantes had built shrines to her. Naturally, this one guy was interviewed and he said, well, how can I pray? If I'm going to smuggle drugs or kill somebody, how can I pray to our Guadalupe? Bad people need somebody to pray to too. You know, so, you know, they began knocking them down. And I used to buy these tiny little silver skulls because I do nichos. They would have doors on them. And I used the skulls, you know, as the door pulls. And when the Federales began wiping out Mitrantecuhtli's, you know, the Santísima Muerte stuff, I couldn't find them anymore.
Mm.
But those are the layers. And then next to it, once again, more layers, the layer between life and death, the interface between life and death, which is very sexual because it's like the door with two sides, right? And the juxtaposition of those two things, once again, just plucks really deep psychic strings in people. So in a way, I'm cheating because I know enough about psychology to know that everybody, no matter what their language or their culture, knows what a skeleton is. They don't know what age it is. They don't know what race it is. They don't know whether it was a man or a woman. They know it was you. So this gives a certain, how can I say, a universal idiom, a sort of iconography that transcends or crosses cultural boundaries by using the skeleton. Nobody can look at it. They either hate it or they love it.
The skeletons bring up an idea of paper thin bones that can just at a moment's notice blow away into the wind. And then did they become part of the collective knowledge of the people, or are they gone? It's huge, wonderful questions. If I could step back a little bit in history right now to point out some other places that the Papel Picado in layers was made. Before we had photography and other things, it was very popular to make hand-cut silhouette of your favorite family. And here, of course, we have George Washington and Martha in some depictions. So that would have been, well, it's even till recently at fairs, you would often see a silhouette artist. And also illustrative. These renditions from Alice in Wonderland and the artist's just delightful imagination as to what it might have looked at. And so these would be layers of imagination cut in the paper flat, but then projecting where the reader of the story was able to better for themselves imagine. The image that's on the right, of course, does have several layers of paper in it. And we can't forget that this is so cross-cultural. Namely, here are some tiny items. Those are only 3 inches across that I collected personally in People's Republic. And of course, what are they? They're farm workers. And watching the people hand cut these, and at Tlacaelel, I want to ask you about the actual technique next, but you see the workers in China, they will layer up several pieces of paper. I can't imagine how they hold them firmly enough and then cut so elegantly and so precisely to get these things. Nothing is handmade. Nothing is done by machine. It's all handmade, every last piece of it. How has been your experience, Tlacaelel, with hand cut work?
You know, my friend MJ had asked, do I sketch these things out first? And again, when I first was taught or exposed or when somebody first asked me about Matisse, and I didn't know who he was, I started to experiment I had done that before I knew who he was. So I don't sketch these things out. I just, again, like the Fauvists, right? The crazy mad artist. I just start to cut and I don't draw. And then I just cut, and it's a very kinetic process. I'm a restless person, as you know, we all are. We're all kinetic beings. When we're asleep, we're breathing. When we're asleep, our hearts are pumping. When we're asleep, we have to turn, we roll, we move. We're constantly not stagnant. And so as a kinetic person, I have this sense of needing to express myself. And in this case, I do it through my art. It's my way of taking all this energy that I have and channel it into a product, if you will. But what I do is I hold the paper down with one hand and I use a razor blade to cut. One time did I actually cut my finger because I held the razor blade, my finger too far out, and as I was pulling the razor blade, I did that kind of thing. And so that was only once, but I hold the paper down with my hand and then I cut the paper with the razor blade in my hand. I don't use holder to put the razor blade into. I use the razor blade directly in my hand. So it's a very spontaneous act. There's no sense of preconceived notion or idea or sketching it out. Because I mean, if I sketch it out, I have to cut it backwards and then turn it over so that my pencil marks aren't seen. So no, I don't use pencil. I don't use markers. I just go at it. And then I step back and I go, oh yeah, torso. Or in the case of the blue piece, oh yes, pyramid. But that's my way of maintaining my connection to my Chicano history. And so no, I don't sketch. And also I'm very careful how I hold the paper to cut.
I have a question. You don't have a preconceived idea of what you do, what you're going to do. You
Well,
just
I'll tell
start
you,
cutting, and then you see something in it, and you develop what you see.
well,
I don't.
yeah,
want
let
to
me
know
explain
more.
it like this. I had the great fortune to go to New York City to train in some of the studios of the wonderful modern dance artists like Martha Graham and Paul Santasardo and Anna Sokolow and Mae O'Donnell and Merce Cunningham and Alvin Ailey. I traveled to all their studios to get a sense of what each of them does. And so how that has played over into my artwork, there's a real sense of lyricism and a real sense of choreography and dance. And so the flowing line, I start to cut and I get this sense of, woo kind of thing. And so I like to think that that's reflected. Also, I've worked with Oscar Lozoya, who is a well-known photographer, or he was, may he rest in peace. So I worked with him in his studio, and that sense of shading and light, I like to think that somehow that gets captured, but again, very spontaneously. It's not preconceived. Douglas Riva, a world concert pianist that I had the great opportunity to perform with in a performance art piece, the harmonies of the pieces, the combination of the one color with the second color gives a sense of harmony, like two voices, if you will. And that kind of comes through the music. So I've had this great opportunity to work with some fascinating artists in different other mediums. And I like to think that those have informed how I feel when I'm doing my work. I might listen to Douglas Riva, and what I'm hearing might be influencing how I'm cutting or turning my hand or flicking my wrist. So no, I don't draw, I don't preconceive, and I step back, like I say, and I go, oh yeah, we're going to call that torso. So the pieces evolve on their own, really. I'm sort of the medium, and I just let the energy channel through me, because again, we're all kinetic. Anita, you do the same thing, right? I mean, you may
I know
have
what you're talking about.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I understand. I get it.
It's very, I'm interested in pursuing your connection with Oscar Lozoya, my colleague in photography. And of course, he's well known for his death renditions, his various saints as represented as muerte. And obviously, the connection with the Days of the Dead paper, Picada, like Karen was showing, this one, a traditional one. This is in the museum, is it not, Claire?
Yes, it is.
And there are others here too that I own. They have to be 35 years old, the traditional flags. And let's see, and then of my own photojournalistic work, when it was still considered okay in Mexico to visit schools while kids were doing preparations for festivals. And so tell us about how Oscar influenced you.
Well, I spent a lot of time with Oscar Lozoya in his studio. I was in a play by Garcia Lorca, and I played the role of the beggar in Bodas de Sangre, Blood Wedding. And I remember I got out of rehearsal and I went home that night, and there was some fishing line sitting on my table. And I picked it up and I pressed it against my skin and I thought, oh, that looks kind of cool. So I went this way. And then I went this way. And then I went this way. And I just was like, wow. So I showed up to Oscar's studio one night. We were going to do a photo session. And I went in the bathroom and I did this thing and I put it all together. And I came out and I said, Oscar, what do you think of this? And he said, we have to photograph that. That became his very famous Quilt Man photograph. So working with him and watching his process, and during that time, I watched him discover the art of Posada, who did those wood carvings of those Muerte, Dia de los Muerte images, the skeletons, dancing. And I watched him look through that book, and he became very enamored with that. And then out of that grew his Muerte photographs. And so then he started getting people in his studio and painting them up like skeletons and dressing them in fancy dresses. And it was really another wonderful experience with him. He passed away from lung cancer. And I remember we would do a photo shoot for 6 hours. And then we would go into the dark room and he would develop these things another 4 or 5 hours. But he would smoke while he was working with these chemicals. And when I heard he had died of lung cancer, I could only think what was probably, smelling the fumes, then combining with the smoke of his cigarette. And it was a very tragic thing. And it never occurred to me at the time to say, hey, dude, what's going on here? What are you doing? Because I was in there with him. But I wasn't inhaling, I wasn't smoking. But it was really interesting to watch his process as an artist, as a photographer. And then again, I really truly feel like that experience with him has also informed my Papel Picado. I have some pieces that I've done that reflect some of what I experienced with him in terms of the Muerte images.
The layers of culture and the layers of how we all borrow from everybody else. And I think it's so wonderful that artists in general say, yes, borrow from what I do, use it in the manner of your choosing, make something new, make something different, add a new layer to the community consciousness.
Well, again, too, the whole idea of Papel Picado, or in the case of Anita's work, the layering of life, our history, every decade is a history, whether it's the emancipation of slaves, whether it's the exploding of Hiroshima, the bomb in Hiroshima. There's that layer of evolution that we have as a human species, but also that each artwork that we do as an artist is layered. It becomes a reflection of our daily lives. This is the piece that I did this today or over the last 6 months. And then we sort of put that away, and then we do the next piece, and then we put that away. And little by little, these pieces evolve into a reflection of our entire lives, and in a sense, become our history books.
Yeah, they're profoundly autobiographical. A really penetrating psychologist would look at our work and really get us down, It's all there. We can't even keep it out.
Well, and it's particularly, I think, also interesting in what we're talking about, this layering of meaning, layering of life, layering of experience, that throughout there does seem to be the muerte, the recurring theme of death, this recurring image of skeletal imagery, that death is always going to be present throughout those layers. It is going to be something that is returned to throughout history and also in so many contemporary artists' work. Anita, that was what you were talking about in the B piece, which is currently on view in our Gallery 12. There is such a strong representation of death there, but also of life and also of growing things, and the bee as pollinator, and all of those levels are kind of encased in that image.
The whole idea of La Muerte again is that in Western thinking or Western society, death is something to be feared. And for the Aztec culture, we don't go to heaven. We return to the underworld, and we're escorted there by monarch butterflies. So for some of us, we realize that death is part of the next stage. It's part of the evolution of life. and then it becomes death, and then we go on to the next stage. You know, the physicists teach us that even though this physical body that we manifest gets cast off, that electrical energy that maintains who we are continues on. And so some people interpret that as being, you go to heaven and you live in heaven for good, or in the case of the Aztecas, you know, we return to the underworld. But nonetheless, even though the physical body is gone, that energy that we maintain continues on. And so how do we feel about death? And I think for the Aztecas, it becomes a celebration of the next step, the next stage.
That's very deep. I think that the Mesoamerican concept of time is circular. It is not linear. You know, it's a spiral. It involves evolution, but it's always circular.
In Anita's piece, the bee piece that I admire so much, we learn a great deal about you, not just the history. And nobody has mentioned what I see in that piece as circularity, because the light is coming out of the womb. And so the rebirth is already there in that piece, my opinion.
It's also about collectivity, you know, as opposed to, once again, the linear thinking culture, as opposed to like a circular culture where everything is recycled and goes back upon itself, because the bees take care of each other. The hive, you know, is like a unit to itself. They cooperate, they take care of each other. It's a collective.
Which does, again, circle back to the way that culture thinks about death. In non-Western cultures, the dead were still present in life. You do consult your ancestors. You do ask questions of those that are past, and they then reflect on your life. They then inform your life in your own choices and in the progression of history. The theory in, you know, Teotihuacan, which was the sort of ancestral city of Tenochtitlan, was this idea of deified ancestors that were visited along the Avenue of the Dead, that central north-south axis of the city, as being a very central part of daily life. That was a critical way you made your decisions, who you got married to, how time progressed. And those deified ancestors are again represented through the medium of paper in the codices as little bundles. So that perception of the dead is what is past, the dead is no longer present. We cannot, that's something that is beyond us. That is one very distinct perspective, one very Western perspective.
There's a big difference between the whole, I don't know what I would call it, the North American concept of death and the Mexican death. Big difference. And of course, that means there's a big difference in our perspective on life. Once again, circular time as opposed to linear time. That's a big difference. We're comfortable with death. We make jokes about it. We have Day of the Dead. We make candy. You know, like we're really comfortable. You know, there are places where they prop up the corpse. Babies, especially, are photographed dressed up as saints. You know, we're very close to death. And in this country, The American Way of Death is a famous book that talks about the incredible distance we place between ourselves and death, as opposed to this intimacy.
It's rather unwise to make a great distance, considering that it's
The inevitable, right?
Experience. Days of the Dead has been a project of mine for some decades, and I have definitely experienced a feeling of presence of ancestors out if you're burning a little incense and in the evening you invite them, and there is a spirit that does come. I am absolutely convinced.
And I'm not afraid of death either. I've done it. I've been clinically dead. And my experience is not particularly unique. As a matter of fact, it's almost a cliche among the many people who've had after-death experiences. It's happened to me more than once. It's like a deep initiation. It's euphoric. It's absolutely euphoric.
You know, thinking of the tradition and the past and how all of this has evolved to all of us here today, communing and communicating, I did some research about what about the future of paper? Where is it going to go from here? And I came to discover that scientists use paper to origami, in fact, to design the things that will go out into space, you know, some of the satellites. To be able to build that and then do a prototype is going to be very expensive. So what they do is they take origami and they fan these things out and they say, well, this is how it's going to, how these things will compact all of this into a satellite. And then when it gets up into space, these things will unfold. And so it's very interesting to think that paper's not done yet. I mean, we use it for records, for money, for painting, for documents, for home use. Paper is just, you know, it's probably one of our most valuable resources. But to think that it's going into the future and not in a sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, where it's hyperspace, but it's real. And so the scientists take these origami things to make these satellites, and then they go, oh yeah, this is how it's going to work. And then they build these things, and then they shoot them up there, and these things unfold, and this thing becomes huge. So paper's not out of our future by no means.
Sell this $5 spatula on Amazon and compete with.
What was that?
It was
That's
just
fascinating.
You
No.
have an unwanted guest. What Tlacaelel is saying, Claire, tell us a little bit about the museum and you as the curator. How do you deal with your collection that is paper and make sure that it is preserved for future guests to view?
You're muted.
There we go. I think at the museum, I am a great nuisance to many people with my nagging about proper conservation methods. I think I'm a bit of a pest that way, about pests and about other things, but specifically when it comes to preserving paper and works on paper are very, what we would say is fugitive. We are very, very careful with those things. Works on paper and textiles. Those are the two that I'm always particularly paranoid about. But generally, the perspective around paper is ideally you want a paper that is archival. And that kind of language refers directly to the way that the paper is made. For a significant period of time, really, we can say pretty solidly for the last 100 years, commercially made paper has been processed through a means of different chemical baths that, depending on the technique, can result in greater degradation over time. So when you hear of acid-free paper, that's referring to the particular way that the fibers are processed. That is, certain chemicals are not used that acidify the fibers themselves and break it down naturally. So a yellowing of an old newspaper is an acidic paper that is breaking down those fibers. So an acid-free paper ideally will not have those chemicals involved and will last longer. But if the beautiful lithograph that you're looking at or drawing or cut paper or whatever artwork is not itself archival, the material is not itself archival, that presents a bit of an issue. There is only so much that we can do in halting that degradation over time. However, things like UV radiation, humidity, and pests, there's particular insects that love to eat paper, and I fear them deeply. If they were to invade the museum, I rue that day, but we are very careful to monitor for those pests and every so often change out works on paper. Really, ultimately, those things should never be on display much longer than a year. It's tricky when you're new to an institution, and there's many things that are hanging in the museum that I need to swap out for that reason. But UV radiation, humidity, pests, those are all things that we really consider, and also acknowledge that there is a certain, what we call in collections, inherent vice. Inherent vice is something that the piece itself brings with it and that might cause it harm. So, non-archival paper, acidic paper, those are things that will eventually harm the piece itself. And all we can do is really try to remove any helping hands on that degradation and preserve it for as long as possible. So it's a challenge, but it's something that we're always thinking about.
Light is a big thing there, as you're just mentioning. I know that at the George O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe, a good deal of the collection is under very dim lighting because the original paper was not of the best quality. And then we think about artwork that's on cartonnage, artwork that's on papyrus. What do you do there? At least we know the papyrus certainly lasted rather a bit longer than many papers that are currently commercially processed.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing, that certain of these, what we would consider more, and I hate this word, but primitive technologies, they last a lot better than a lot of the things that we think are far more advanced and much more technologically specialized. The older techniques work. They last much longer. There are papers that are thousands of years old, and they hold the pigment, they hold their structural integrity far better than some things from the last 100 years do. Luckily, the museum, given that it's an old building, and this is a thing I struggle against, lighting usually is not an issue. Usually we have it pretty dim, whether we like it or not, and so we can keep things preserved in that way. So that's one positive.
How many different aspects are there to this art? It is just most extraordinary to hear about all of that. And Tlacaelel, you were addressing a question from a viewer that was about your archive. Now, I want to ask you a couple of other questions about specifically your pieces, and I suppose we should put this specific one. I have not personally seen these. Are these sections that are cut and laid onto paper, or is the white cut out and it's green behind? Which is it?
Yes. I try to use paper that I find that's in great condition. In the case of what you're looking at now, I was in a secondhand store and I found this wonderful watercolor book for watercolors, and I bought that, and I said, there's my canvases. So it was white, and I started to cut into it, and then got my images, and then I laid that over the green or the blue, excuse me. And so it really is a white sheet of paper on top of the handmade blue paper or green paper. So I always cut my images and then I lay them on a colored background. And sometimes that might have been red and blue. There's a piece I have called Flying Red. And that is a blue paper laid on a red background. So yeah, I just cut the image, make a stencil, and then I put it over another color. In this case, the white over the blue or the green.
Interesting. And so now in these complex pieces, you've used a variety of different papers and techniques, because some of it is on top and some of it's on the bottom. Yes.
Yeah. In the case of the Zia looking symbol there with the nuclear neutron in the middle, that's black paper, and that's all one piece. And then it's laid on over the blue. And then I just added the nuclear image in yellow and pink So yeah, the black is all one piece laid on the blue. And if you look, there is a certain hidden image, and it's really kind of a scary image. You get the two eyes, and then the bottom there are the teeth. And, it's like, that's what nuclear technology is. It's scary. And that's why we have the Nuclear Waste Isolation Project down south of here, because when Fermi and all those guys were developing the technology, and this happens a lot in our culture, we say, wow, we invented the new best thing, plastic, yay, right? And then we don't realize the after effects. In this case, they developed the nuclear bomb, and now you've got all this nuclear waste that's going to last for thousands of years. So what do? You bring it to New Mexico and you bury it at the Waste Isolation Project. And who knows what's going to happen? That's going to take millions of years before it becomes non-toxic. And so this piece really does, in a very subtle way, reflect our nuclear age. But yet again, the cross suggestion is that sense of, we pray, we hope that we can have peace in the world, that mankind can learn to not have to be so greedy to take over other nations, that we don't have to invent bombs to kill each other. And so that's what that piece is. And then this next piece is a black sheet of paper. And I cut the red first, and then I laid that on the black. And then I lifted the red back up and I put the yellow cross, and then the blue paper with the red paper. And so that was more of a process, which is not typical for what I do. I don't typically combine a lot of colors. Usually it's two colors, the original image laid on the backing. But that piece, Ventana Rosa, is what I call it. That's on display at the Michael Gorman Gallery. He has also archival prints that are also available. But it's really been wonderful to work with Michael Gorman. It's wonderful, the idea that he's the nephew of R.C. Gorman. And then, of course, his grandfather, the code talker. I feel so honored to be part of that tradition of our New Mexico history. And so to be part of the Michael Gorman Gallery is just, it continues our tradition of how our state is evolving, how our art is evolving, how our work is being layered, culturally, historically, aesthetically.
I want to point out your evolving and flexibility, because the nuclear piece on this side is indeed quite symmetrical in its feel. And then the other one is completely different. And so you are not in one set road. You have expanded as the ideas present themselves to you. And I have to ask, for people who are interested in trying it themselves, do you use single-edged or double-edged blades?
I use single-edged, and when it becomes dull, I turn it and use the other edge. And so again, it's just, I go to the art store and I buy a packet of razor blades, and there's maybe 200. And so I just cut, and once it starts to become dull, I toss that out. But again, I really try to upscale or upcycle, as Michael Gorman says, my art materials, because there's a lot of waste in our world. And in the case of the printing company in New York City, saying, throw all that out. And I'm like, no, there's beauty here. And so I used a lot of that paper for years. I still have a few pieces left, and I'm very reluctant to use that until I find the right moment. But we're a throwaway society, and we do that not just with materials, but we do it with people. And it's a sad thing, we never saw homelessness like we've seen in our society today. It's a very sad reflection on what our country has become or is becoming. So throwing things away and just toss it out. And there's artists that use cast off materials to create some very beautiful things. And a lot of these materials that you're looking at here, in the case, like I was saying, of the pyramids piece, that could have ended up in the trash. And so I come along, I buy this at the secondhand store. Maybe I paid $3 for the whole pad, and there's 50 sheets in there. And so I have 50 canvases, waiting to be discovered, those images to come out and evolve again, the layers of each day that I'm working them. And pieces can be done in 45 minutes, or in the case of the Ventana Rosa there, the stained glass window image, that took me a couple of weeks because I didn't just attack it like the Fauvist artist.
Ah. But you're very much like our own Jared de la Cruz, who creates all of his sculptural work out of found objects, very much so. So yes, thank you.
We're heading into the last few minutes. The conversation has been wonderful, and I want to make sure that we voice MJ's question, if you can see that in the chat, Tlacaelel, about what Papel Picado artists used before scissors were invented. I thought that was a great question that kind of speaks to the resources.
I don't know what the Aztecas used when they were cutting their prayer model, but I'll bet you they probably used obsidian.
Yeah.
Obsidian blades, yeah.
Yeah, obsidian blades. So we can probably be sure there. I'm not sure what the Chinese use, because paper cutting has been around 2,000 years, even before the time of Jesus. Mm-hmm. So MJ, my good friend, leave it to her to ask those wonderful questions. But, I don't know. I don't know what other artists have used in the past. But I know if they've been able to do precision surgery, on people's brains and cut, it must be some form of a stone, just like the obsidian. I don't know, Claire, maybe you can speak to that.
I can't speak to paper cutting elsewhere, but I do know that because obsidian blades and paper, the subject of paper is so interesting in Mesoamerica and Mexica peoples, but paper was used as part of sacrificial offerings. You would saturate paper with blood before you burned it as a way of that auto sacrifice. And of course, the obsidian blade was very much tied into sacrifice as well. So those materials have always been tied to one another in that tradition. I can't speak to other parts of the world, though.
Great question, MJ.
There's a second part to that question regarding glue. If you use glue, and so, or a certain type of glue, but what I'm kind of wondering is, do you use glue at all? Or how are the layers?
Yeah, glue causes paper to wrinkle, and it just is not a good medium for paper. There is a process I use. I don't know if I should reveal it, but oftentimes I won't back the paper. I'll tack it maybe in 4 corners and then just lay it down, and it just rests there. But there's also a tape that sometimes I will use called ATG tape. It's double-sided. You've probably seen it. And I use that, and it actually works very well. The piece, the Ventana Rosa there, as I said, I did it 20 years ago, and I don't see any issues with the tape affecting the paper. It helps to keep it flat. It helps to keep it solid. So I do use the ATG tape when I want to make sure the whole piece is really flat and adhere to its backing.
May I clarify that there is ATG tape that is archival and also non-archival. So be sure if you purchase a box of it, ask for the archival portion. You'll also find the Neschen company, originally out of Germany, has a great many supplies for repairing paper and books. And you'll find those are all archival if you're doing it yourself. Now, we do have a question that I'm not sure how this relates, but Linda Hall is asking, will AI in some way become a topic that you address in your art? And I imagine that goes to Anita particularly, but to both of you as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. I mean, AI is just a place that I haven't gone yet because I'm so terrified of the implications. I just don't know what to do. But I can remember years ago, I was living in Egypt and I was working for Hassan Fathy, who won the Aga Khan Prize for Earth and Architecture. And someone said something about, well, aren't you afraid someone's going to copy your work? And Hassan Bey said, oh, that's wonderful. Not only is the best possible compliment, they're giving you lots of free advertising, because if they're copying, they're never going to be able to match the original. So, you know.
Yeah, Renee Templeton also is very much present today because of her willingness to allow her images to continue to be used. And because of that, her legacy continues. For me, AI, you know what? I don't know much about it. I'll let that take its life of its own. And if somehow my work gets sucked into that, well, then that's part of the evolution of the layers of evolution and life. So I don't know about AI, and do I care? It's going to do what it's going to do, irregardless of me. So if it takes my works and does stuff with them, I'll be like Renee Templeton and say, yay.
You know, I let anybody use my images, you know, like all of the organizations that I belong to. Some of them have taken the images and used them for their logos, and that's fine with me. You knew Rennie, I knew her too, you know, Rennie Templeton. You know, but
so Linda, I definitely will look into AI because I guess you did sort of touch a nerve as far as like being experiencing or expressing discomfort. That's, you probably have put something out here that I should explore, and that's the issue of AI and how it will impact my work. So thank you for sort of bringing that to our attention.
As
So
you
kind of like a
Amy,
hunter-gatherer, you know, in this century, you know, in confronted with all of this digital technology, I feel like a hunter-gatherer, and that somehow my incarnation of this was just a big mistake. I'm really intimidated by it.
and Anita, your hunter-gatherer simile is actually quite good. As an image maker, you might, and author, I've delved pretty far into this myself, and we want to use AI as, in my opinion, right now, as what is called ideation, giving you idea, cross-cultural potential. And so if you give a prompt to an AI asking for a certain image, like Oscar Lozoya, for instance, you may get a whole bunch of different ideas, and then you may borrow a little bit here and a little bit there and two things down here, and then you become part of that cultural continuum that we're talking about, that to me is quite important. And the borrowing part, yes, that's what we do as artists. We borrow the words, we borrow the colors, we borrow the style, the dimension, the architecture.
We can't help it. It all goes in. Ever since I was little, every piece of art that I ever looked at got into me.
mm-hmm.
Yes, that's correct. And to me, at this point, that's how I can use AI. I don't know how other people plan to use it, and it will evolve. And Karen, we're kind of near. I have an ending comment, but I'm sure you do. Will you wrap us up, please?
Yes, I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight and our guest panelists, and thank you to Claire for joining us, and as always, Sarah, thank you for your expertise and helping bring these programs to fruition. The museum is open 7 days a week through October from 10 to 5. Beginning in November, we start our winter hours. We're closed on Wednesdays. Also, your donations support programs and exhibits throughout the year. If you'd like to make a donation to the museum or become a member, please visit our website at www.millicentrogers.org. Sarah.
And my last comment, we are like the fashion people in Paris. You go to the house and you have your champagne, and they begin the process of all the models coming in with the new things. And what do they end with? the bride. And thanks to my recent acquaintance, Jennifer Kaufman, she provides her own version of Papel Picado in a very unusual bridal place. She made personally all these Picado banners for her daughter's recent wedding in Santa Fe, and they are huge. As you see, this hotel setting, not particularly spiritual, and she very diligently over time, there you can see the frontispiece of the ceremony, and how nice a thing to have a parent producing beautiful art that in this time-honored manner. Is it what a fun thing? And we end on this wonderful idea, and we can go all go happy, because wedding is always wonderful.
Sarah, we have one open question, so I do want to address this. Vivian is bringing up the question of other cultural expressions with cut paper, and examples of historic cut paper with artist Kara Walker, African-American artist who uses cut paper to memorialize African history in the US. I think we have found this wonderful common thread to talk about the plurality of culture through the arts with paper, and it's been a beautiful conversation. I don't know if anybody wants to make mention of Kara Walker, or if we should just leave this conversation open-ended for people to explore further, and maybe we'll revisit it also.
I think it would be a great idea. Ask our guests to help us with the next panel.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening. And we'll see you next month.
Thank you very much.
Ometeo.
Bye-bye.
Hasta luego. Adios.
Adios.